Pep Guardiola saw this coming, before the goals, before the headlines, and before anyone bothered to look past the minutes column.
Is it going to open up for City? Burn gets into the challenge.
While most people judge trust by starts, Pep Guardiola was watching something else entirely.
Had to be patient, had to be small spaces, had to be consistent to go to the moments in behind.
A forward who didn't need 90 minutes to leave fingerprints on a match. A player who kept tilting games quietly, efficiently, relentlessly every time he was allowed onto the pitch. On paper, the story looked confusing.
We were together as a team. From the first minute, we were very focused on the job, and I think we showed our mentality and our passion in this game, and we're very happy to reach a final.
One season, 7 goals in 16 appearances. The next, just 281 minutes across an entire campaign. Less visibility, less noise, and yet more precision. Goals, assists, higher pass accuracy, fewer touches, bigger consequences.
Highlight is for him, yeah, right? Of course, to be with him. We knew it, so in Germany, in Eintracht Frankfurt, good numbers.
Then came the moment that stripped away every excuse. A Carabao Cup semi-final, heavy rotation, no margin for error. And in barely half an hour, Omar Marmoush ripped the tie apart with a ruthless early brace, turning a semi-final into a procession and sending Manchester City back to Wembley. Not through dominance, but through timing. This isn't the story of a player losing relevance. It's the story of a player being misunderstood. Because when you stop counting minutes and start analysing movement, spacing, transitions, and timing, a different picture emerges. One Guardiola understood from the beginning. This is why Omar Marmoush doesn't need more minutes to prove his value, and why Guardiola never stopped believing, even when everyone else did. On January 23, 2025, Manchester City didn't sign Omar Marmoush as a project or a gamble. They signed him like a weapon. A 4.5-year deal, a fee widely reported around £59 million, and the kind of move that only happens when Guardiola believes a player fits the machine. And the first tell wasn't even a goal. It was the fact he was thrown straight into the lineup. 2 days after the announcement, Marmoush made his City debut on January 25th, starting in a 3-1 home win over Chelsea. That's not how Guardiola treats players he's still figuring out. That's an early signal. I trust your profile, I trust your intelligence. Now show me your execution. Guardiola's own words after that debut were revealing because they weren't about settling in or learning the system. They were about the traits Pep values most when minutes are competitive. Calmness, speed, decision-making, and work without the ball. He described Marmoush as a calm guy with pace who can shoot and is intelligent at defending. Then came the key line. I am really pleased with what I've seen so far. That is Guardiola telling you, this isn't only about goals, this is about reliability inside the structure. Less than a month later, the proof moment arrived. On February 15th, 2025, City beat Newcastle 4-0, and Marmoush scored a first-half hat-trick, his first career hat-trick. Reports noted it came in a rapid burst, effectively turning the match into damage control for Newcastle before the half-hour mark. Now here's the important part. Guardiola didn't react like a manager surprised by a breakout. He reacted like a manager watching something inevitable. He said City knew it, referenced how Marmoush had missed big chances earlier, and then delivered the line that frames this entire story. We knew sooner or later he could show what he is. And then came the real Pep detail, the psychological layer. Hopefully he can handle the compliments. That isn't hype. That's Guardiola saying, this is normal, this is the player we bought. The question isn't ability, it's how you live with attention. If the hat-trick showed finishing, the FA Cup showed why Pep uses him the way he does. On March 30th, 2025, City went to Bournemouth in the FA Cup quarter-final. It wasn't comfortable. City missed a penalty, Haaland went off injured, and the game was on a knife edge, exactly the kind of match where Guardiola values players who can enter chaos and still execute. Marmoush came on for Haaland and scored the winner almost immediately, a substitute's impact that turned a tense quarter-final into another semi-final run.
Got a hold of it, O'Reilly has. Beautifully done for Marmoush!
This is where the minutes misunderstanding begins. Because to casual eyes, this looks like a striker who's drifting in and out of the team. But in Guardiola's world, this is often intentional. Start the match with control, structure, and positional discipline. Then inject speed, diagonal running, and transition threat when the game breaks. Open. Marmoush fits that second phase perfectly, not because he can't start, but because he can change the texture of a game when opponents are already mentally and physically stretched. Then came the moment that gave him a different kind of headline. On May 20th, 2025, Marmoush opened the scoring in a 3-1 win over Bournemouth with a long-range strike that later won the Premier League Goal of the Season award. So by the end of that first half season, the resume was already unusually dense. A high-profile January signing on a long contract, a debut start against Chelsea with Guardiola publicly pleased, a hat-trick versus Newcastle with Pep, framing it as inevitable, a cup tie winner off the bench when pressure spiked, a season-defining strike later recognised as Goal of the Season, and statistically the baseline production backed it up. 16 Premier League appearances, 7 league goals in 2024/25. Because football culture is addicted to a specific type of evidence: starts. If you're not starting every week, people assume one of three things. You're not trusted, you're not good enough, or you're being phased out. But Guardiola's squads don't work like that, especially in the forward line. At City, minutes are not only about talent, they're about game state planning, what the match will need in minute 65, not just minute 1, rest defense stability, what risks you can take without losing control, pressing coherence, who triggers pressure, who blocks lanes, who forces the pass Pep wants, and role specificity. Some players are chosen to start control, others to finish chaos. That's why a player like Marmoush can look secondary to outsiders, while internally he's being used exactly how Pep wants, as a rhythm shifter. A cameo goal isn't luck in this system. It's often design, timing, opponent fatigue, space opening, and the right profile entering the pitch at the right second. And this is the foundation for everything that happens next. Because once his minutes drop, people will think his story is shrinking, but the influence doesn't. Here's where the public perception split from the reality. In 2024/25, the story was easy to understand. Marmoush played often enough to stay visible. He scored, he had big headline moments, and his role looked straightforward. But 2025/26 is a different kind of season. One where his value doesn't show up through weekly starts, but through what happens every time Guardiola opens the door. And that's exactly why people misread him. On paper, the season looks like a reduction, and football fans are conditioned to treat that as a verdict. In the Premier League 2025/26, Marmoush has played roughly 281 to 285 minutes, with 1 goal and 1 assist. That minute total is the trap. Because when a player is living mostly on cameos, people don't track influence, they track status. They assume he's not trusted, he's not as good as last year, or he's being phased out. But City under Guardiola doesn't work like that. Minutes aren't always a ranking system, they're often a game state decision. This is the deeper pattern. Guardiola has used Marmoush as a rhythm changer, not because he can't start, he has started this season, but because his profile is built for the moments where matches loosen. When legs tire, when lines stretch, when one run behind the defense flips the whole structure, Marmoush becomes a tactical lever. And Guardiola has said it plainly in his own way. After Marmoush scored and won man of the match in a 2-0 win over Wolves on January 24th, 2026, Guardiola didn't speak like a manager trying to build a player. He spoke like a manager describing a weapon with a specific purpose. He called him a special player, praised his dynamic runs, and framed him as a forward who thrives in transition actions, exactly the type of match phase Pep tries to control late in games. That Wolves match matters because it shows the truth of this season. Marmoush can sit out for weeks, return, and still look like someone who belongs at the centre of the plan. Back into the starting 11 after time away, he scored, won man of the match, and Guardiola essentially explained why he keeps him in the rotation even when the minutes don't look glamorous. These aren't random highlights, they're consistent with the same theme. Marmoush doesn't need a long runway, he needs a window, and then came the match that turns this from nice narrative into something you can't argue with. Carabao Cup semi-final second leg, February 4th, 2026, Manchester City versus Newcastle. City won 3-1 on the night and 5-1 on aggregate to reach Wembley. Marmoush scored 2 early goals, Tijani Reinders added a third, and the tie was effectively dead before half-time. This is what makes it the perfect exhibit. First, it's a high-stakes stage, not a comfortable league afternoon. A semi-final is a credibility match. You either handle it or you don't. Second, he didn't grow into the game. He ended it early. 2 goals quickly isn't just output, it's momentum control. It changes what Newcastle can risk, how they press, how they transition, and how City can manage the rest of the night. Third, it fit Guardiola's rotation logic perfectly. Even with changes, City still looked clear because the roles were clear. Marmoush wasn't asked to be the weekly headline striker. He was asked to deliver a decisive phase of the game. And he did it. Newcastle did score through Anthony Elanga later, but structurally City never looked like a team losing grip. They looked like a team that had already solved the tie. So the 2025/26 shift isn't a decline story, it's a visibility story. When a player's season is built on short appearances, irregular rhythm, and selective deployment, most people stop tracking him properly. They confuse reduced minutes with reduced value. But if you track the right things, the game state, the timing of his entries, the way his goals land like interrupts, the pattern becomes obvious. Minutes have been limited. Influence hasn't. If you want to understand why Guardiola keeps trusting Omar Marmoush, you have to stop thinking of him as just another forward and start reading him as a tactical function. Because when Marmoush plays, City don't simply gain a runner. They gain depth on demand, the one thing that turns possession from safe to dangerous and makes elite midfielders look like elite providers again. Guardiola basically said it himself. Marmoush is a guy for transition actions, more a striker than a proper winger, with dynamic energy and runs. That's not emotional praise, that's a job description. City's technicians, Rodri, Bernardo Silva, Reinders, Foden, are at their best when defenders are forced into uncomfortable choices. Marmoush creates those choices by doing three things relentlessly: pinning centre-backs by standing on their shoulder so they can't step out freely, splitting the line with diagonal runs across the blind side, and attacking the space between fullback and centre-back. The hardest seam to defend in a Guardiola system. The effect is simple. When the backline is stretched vertically, City's passes stop being sideways control and become final third access. Look at the Newcastle Carabao Cup semi-final second leg. Tactical breakdowns of City's setup show exactly how Guardiola wanted it. Fullbacks Nunes and Ait Nouri had a mandate to attack and were occasionally pushing across into midfield. A central trio of Nico, O'Reilly and Reinders held the middle, and up front, Marmoush with Foden and Semenyo on the flanks. That structure matters because it creates a consistent in-possession picture. City build with control. The fullbacks step in to protect transitions. The midfield forms the platform, and Marmoush gives them the vertical outlet the moment Newcastle's line is even slightly misaligned. In other words, the safe City becomes the sharp City. This is the part most people miss. Marmoush doesn't just finish moves, he improves passes. He does it by being available in two opposite ways at the same time. He shows to feet as a bounce option, especially when a number 10 like Foden receives under pressure. Then he threatens in behind immediately after the bounce, meaning defenders can't relax after the first pass. That's how you turn a midfielder's 10-yard pass into a chance-creating action. And you could see it in that Newcastle semi-final. City rotated the squad but still produced a ruthless first half. Marmoush's early double, then Reinders adding a third. The why isn't only finishing, it's the chain reaction his movement creates inside the structure. Guardiola's problem in big games is always the same. How do you stay aggressive without becoming open? This is where Marmoush is uniquely valuable. In Guardiola's words, he's for transition actions, which means City can threaten space without abandoning their positional discipline. A good example is the match against Wolves on January 24th, 2026. The lineup showed Marmoush leading the line with creators behind him, Silva, Reinders, Cherki, and Rodri anchoring. He scored early, then City's second came before halftime. That's City using vertical threat to win the match phase, not just dominate possession. This doesn't mean Haaland stopped scoring. It means City stopped being predictable. Guardiola has already framed Marmoush as someone who can ease the pressure on Haaland's shoulders, specifically by adding goals and threat from the same central lane. Tactically, Marmoush helps Haaland in two main ways. When Haaland plays, Marmoush can occupy defenders with runs that pull a centre-back away from the Haaland zone, opening the cutback lane that City love. When Haaland doesn't start, like against Newcastle, Marmoush gives City a striker who still threatens depth, so the midfield's passing game doesn't become sterile. Either way, opponents can't build their entire defensive plan around one reference point. Why is that 3-1 win the cleanest proof? Because the tactical setup described a plan built around fullbacks stepping into midfield, a stable central trio, and Marmoush leading the line with runners either side. Then the match delivered exactly that. Two early Marmoush goals, tie killed fast, City never losing control. That is Guardiola's logic made visible. Control plus depth equals inevitability. Marmoush isn't a vibes pick. He's a structural upgrade. When you zoom out and assess the landscape properly, this stops being just a story about one player. It becomes a story about optionality and why Omar Marmoush's return to rhythm quietly expands everything Pep Guardiola wants to do with this team. Because Marmoush rejoining the squad in form doesn't simply add depth, it gives Guardiola another tactical machine to deploy when the game state changes. That's the real value here. When City need goals, there's no longer a single pressure point. Guardiola can lean into Erling Haaland as the reference, or pivot to Marmoush's timing, movement and transition threat. One pins centre-backs with physical gravity, the other destabilises them with speed, diagonals and unpredictability. Together they stop opponents from building defensive plans around a single striker profile. When City run into low blocks, the solutions multiply. You can stretch the pitch with Yeremi Doku. You can manipulate half spaces with Ryan Cherki. You can attack the far post and weak side with Antoine Semenyo. And crucially, Marmoush's constant availability to feet or in behind gives those wide profiles a central reference that keeps the block honest. When City need creativity and control, Guardiola still has the keys he trusts most. Phil Foden between the lines, Bernardo Silva dictating rhythm and angles, Rodri anchoring the entire structure. Add Tijani Reinders to that mix, and suddenly the passes aren't just recycling possession, they're feeding movement with purpose. This is where Marmoush's form becomes strategically significant, because every time he plays, he gives those midfielders a living target. Someone who doesn't wait for the perfect pass, but creates the pass by moving first. Someone who punishes hesitation. Someone who turns half seconds of indecision into chances. That's why the minutes argument no longer holds weight. Guardiola doesn't need Marmoush to start every week for him to matter. He needs him available, sharp and trusted, ready for the exact moments when matches tilt, stretch, or threaten to slip into control without incision. And as City move deeper into the second half of the 2025/26 season, that flexibility could define everything. In the Premier League, where title races are decided by margins thinner than ever. In Europe, where knockout football punishes predictability and rewards timing. In moments where control alone isn't enough, and you need disruption. This squad, rediscovering form across multiple profiles at once suddenly looks dangerous in more ways than one. Not louder, not flashier, just harder to solve. And if this pattern continues, Omar Marmoush won't be remembered as a footnote or rotation piece. He'll be remembered as the player Guardiola always knew he was, the one you turn to when the game changes, and you need the answer immediately.